Greetings to all of Charleston Conference attendees 2022. Welcome to this session on open ebooks, models, trends, and sustainability. My name is Meg White, and I will be our moderator for our conversation today. And it will be a conversation between three outstanding panelists who live in this world every day. And I think they're going to provide excellent background and context on this topic. Models, trends, and sustainability about open access ebooks. So thanks so much. I'm going to do some introductions and then we will begin our Q&A. I am joined today by Lucy Barnes, who is an editor at Open Book Publishers, Steve Fallon, who is Vice President, Americas and Strategic Partnerships for De Gruyter, and Charla Lair, who is Senior Strategist of Open Access and Scholarly Communication Initiatives at Lyrasis. Thank you all for joining us and for agreeing to get up a little bit on the early side today for us this morning to record this session. So welcome to our audience and welcome to the panelists. So to kick us off today, and we mentioned a little bit of this in the abstract, just as we saw the migration for ebooks from print to electronic lag behind the migration from journals to print to electronic, it seems like a lot of the action on the open access development of those models has been on the journal side. The books have lagged behind yet again. They've been slower to gain traction, open access ebooks versus their counterparts on the journal side. You know, talk a little bit about why might that be? Why are the books lagging behind the journals yet again? I'm sure there's some very good reasons, or you have some ideas about that. And moving forward, you know, what may have impeded progress to date, and what can we do to help accelerate that progress in 2022. So I'm going to kick it over to Charla to get it started. And if you want to start that discussion, Charla, over to you.
Sure. So I think the first thing we need to say is we're talking about a specific subset of publishers that are taking their time. There are a lot of open access books out there. You can go to DOAB, Directory of Open Access Books, and see tens of thousands of them. And there are some that are old. They've been around for a long time. And I know Steve will probably talk about, you know, De Gruyter has been investing in open access books for some time. You know, it's a matter of, I think we're looking at specific publishers as to why they're dragging their feet. And we see that in the journal side as well, as far as, you know, why isn't everybody just flipping things over? Now, journals and books are different. They're different parts of the same ecosystem. They're output of scholars in certain disciplines, but journals, you know, work on a faster timeline. Everything is faster because it's briefer. They're briefer bits of information, whereas books, they take a lot of time, which means they take a lot of labor, and labor costs a lot of money. And that's where the challenge really is with books, is trying to find enough money to support that transition for those that we're waiting on, because they are relying on certain levels of revenue in order to stay sustainable in even the paywalled environment. They haven't necessarily been funded as healthily as especially STEM journals. They don't have big funding agencies giving them millions of dollars to do the research. They're finding money through other ways to fund something, a book that can take a long time, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of labor to put together. So one of the big differentiators is the time. Everything with books is different in time. It takes longer for books to start to get cited. It takes longer for all of that. Now, I said we already have a large subset of books out there. We have some publishers that have the last 3-5 years that have started making business models that are more visible to transition to open because of their position in the ecosystem. They're namely like university presses, but you know, you have some of the big commercial entities that have been making open access books as well. The biggest challenge, I think, for making this go faster is actually the discoverability, the visibility, the metrics that go around it, so that those who are looking for them know where to go to find them and to meet their needs. So I'll pass it on to anyone else who might want to add to that.
Yeah, I would say I would echo a lot of what Charlotte has to say. I think that for publishers, the cost of and even for authors, a lot of open access is funded at the article level from the authors, which is a lot cheaper than the book processing charge for a book. I do think you have to think about the idea of short form and long form research and the differences between the two product types. But then also, the formats. You see a lot of publishers that have been able to keep into open access do it with edited volumes as opposed to scholarly monographs. And I think that the cost of making the edited volume more open than the monograph is easier for publishers who have author support. For instance, take a look at InTech Open, which is essentially journals in the form of a book that are a bunch of edited volumes that focus really at the chapter level as opposed to the book level. So I think that I'll tie that all together, and you see that the long form of scholarship in books, it's certainly the market isn't there yet in terms of the funding options for authors as it is for journals.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, I agree. I think books are more complex objects. Long form research is more complex to turn into an ebook to begin with, which is partly why I think you've seen the slowness with open access as well as with digital. But I think part of it may also be the fact that books tend to publish arts, humanities, and social science research. So there is less money in that, as we've been saying. But there's also perhaps a perception that those subjects don't need a kind of immediate publication, or that maybe even it's less urgent that that research is seen by a large number of people, which I would sort of, disagree with. And I think the usage statistics for open access books actually makes a great argument for the public value of, for example, the humanities. And I think this is something that we really need to kind of be focusing on in a lot of our arguments and advocacy about this. I think also there's a kind of opportunity in the fact that it's been slower. I think in journal publishing, you've seen, commercial publishers really focus on the APCs and transformative agreements as the way to transition to open access, which, I would argue, is not necessarily what we might want to see in the book world, that book processing charges are not the way to go. And I think that slowness has allowed a press like Open Book Publishers, my press, which, we started in 2008, so we've been publishing open access books for a long time. And I think in that time, we've picked up experience and knowledge that we're able to use now. And there's sort of space for us to kind of argue for a different way of doing things. So I think there's a positive in it as well. And I think one thing that's missing in terms of how we accelerate open access book publishing is to get author buy-in. I think a lot of the time, authors either don't engage properly with, or not properly, but they don't engage closely with how their books are published. Authors want their books to be published by presses that are sort of weighty in their subject area, for example. So prestige plays quite a large part. It's important for their career development. And I think sometimes access is not a primary consideration for good reasons in many cases. But I think that trying to communicate to authors that actually access is seriously important, and that, for example, as I was mentioning, it may help to boost your discipline and your subject area and all those different things, as well as being good for you personally, are all arguments that we should be making.
And I love the fact that you brought in that there are differences, in fact, in the subject areas, humanities versus STEM. I think that is not insignificant, and hopefully we'll be able to dig into that a little bit more. A lot of threads came out in those initial comments, and thank you for that. But and I want to dig into a few of them. But for right now, let's focus on the infrastructure. Charlotte brought up infrastructure. The infrastructure that's needed to support OA book content, platforms, metadata, discovery, metrics. Do we really need to reinvent the wheel? Or are there components of the landscape, perhaps from the journal side, that can be bought over, or even elements from the commercial ebook side that can be successfully modified to support the infrastructure needed for an open access book ecosystem? And I'll throw that over to the floor, whoever would like to jump in. Charlotte was our first guinea pig, so maybe Steve.
Yeah, sure. I think that it's an interesting question, because I think the way I look at it right now as a publishing house and our partners, which are other university presses and publishing houses, and And I think that independently, each publisher manages that in their own way or thinks about it in their own way. But what I'm learning is more and more that we see that how the crowdfunding models that are part of the open access book ecosystem, where libraries are now directly in various crowdfunding models, are actually dictating the terms in terms of what they would like to see when it comes to access and availability of open access books. And what's kind of what we've kind of figured out over the last couple of years is how libraries would like, libraries' preference would be that we treat the traditional publishing of paid content with open access content the same way. It's this idea of making sure that all the discovery tools are there, that all the metadata is just as enhanced, that it's in the same forms as the paid content. So for us, I think it's about a reliance on the existing infrastructure, improving the infrastructure that actually gets the books out the door. Now, what happens after they get out the door? How do we record, all of the various dissemination of the book? How do we collect all that data? I think that's still a fundamental challenge, but at the access level and at the discovery level, combining it with the paid content for us, since we have publishers that are hybrid open access and traditional content, that's the preferred model that we're seeing from the customers.
So if I could jump in there, I think there's a kind of a balance to be struck here. I think obviously, for open access books, you're not necessarily going to throw out everything that's been done to produce and disseminate closed access content. But I think it is a mistake to think about open access as just something that you kind of click on to existing processes as maybe a kind of extra or bespoke or niche thing that you might do for some books. Obviously, coming from a completely open access press, that might be what you'd expect me to say. But I think particularly for something like distribution, for example, COPIM is building an open dissemination system called Tote. And the intention for that is to make open access book dissemination much less labor on the individual presses, but also more effective. So you have a large number of platforms that might be able to take open access books and share them freely, which of course is the point, but they may accept metadata in many different forms. So then the question is, how can a publisher produce metadata in all those different forms? That's an extra workflow, it's extra labor, and something like Tote is completely new, but is intended to allow the publisher to input the information, and it can then be kind of turned into different types of metadata and sent out to all these different platforms. That it's different to just getting books out to libraries. It's different to thinking about sales channels, although those are also obviously very important. And I think that's one example where to think about infrastructure and publishing an open access book, it is different, and there needs to be some changes in terms of how publishers respond to that.
And there's also, we have to look at where we are. We're still in a transition phase. However, I think there are a lot of entities, publishers, libraries, all funders, all stakeholders out there that are looking for the transformation. How are we, what is the book going to look like in 20, 50 years? Will it even look the same, especially in a digital environment, as more and more books are published in that environment? And what will authors want their books to do? There are already many authors, especially in humanities, arts, humanities, social sciences, that want to attach digital objects to the books, so that they're not putting them off onto a different website, but that they're integrated within the actual experience of the book itself as you are consuming it. And what does that mean? Because at the end of the day, there are only a few platforms right now that can do that. There are only so many ways that you can, all of the like the DOIs and identifying that, making those things discoverable. How do you preserve those things? And so there's like Lucy was saying, there's this delicate balance, and even what Steve is referencing, that we need to meet people where they are so that we can continue to exist and not disrupt everything so much that it prevents those from participating. But at the same time, some of our existing systems that are in place and infrastructures are in place are also only for privileged either types of content, type of publishers, and all of that. And we need to be aware of that as we move through this space. We need to stop unbundling content from the infrastructure and think about it as the entire experience and the potential of where it can go.
Well, and I think I like what you said, Charlotte, about balance, because, as Annette Thomas years ago at Charleston, I think it was 2019, she was then the head of Clarivate, and she gave a keynote address, and it's always stuck with me. And, you know, she's in a commercial entity, but she said from the stage, you know, open, connected, and seamless. And that drumbeat has been in the back of my mind since she made that comment. So I think, you know, in finding that balance, it more becomes about, you know, these individual repositories or platforms are, you know, they're okay. That's where the content lives, but their ability to integrate, I think, is going to be a big component. And that integration would be regardless of, Steve mentioned this perfectly, from a customer standpoint, regardless of format, journal, book, regardless of pay model, open or paywalled, it really is, it's the user that I think would be the center of that experience, because that's what they want: open, connected, and seamless. So anyway, very interesting comments there. So I'm going to move us on to looking specifically, and Charlotte and all three actually mentioned in their opening answer, the economics and funding. So right now, you know, to me, if I were a librarian, I would be completely confused. It looks like a patchwork quilt of business models, and then also from the publisher side, maybe even patchwork quilt of funding models being introduced. And, you know, I'm glancing down at my questions, more exactly experimented with. And I don't know if you agree with that or not, but can you talk a little bit about why we're seeing, you know, sort of this multitude of different business models, funding models, and why this might be the case? And also maybe which models you think are likely to emerge and why? Lucy, you want to lead us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say, I've not been first before. So
thanks.
Yeah, I think it's partly because, as I was saying, there's actually space for experimentation at the moment. You know, you've not got a kind of dominance of a particular model in the way that you may have in journal publishing. And so, you know, things like book processing charges and transformative agreements, have not been as entrenched. You know, you've seen examples of presses trying to do that. For example, I think Springer have a couple of transitional agreements with different institutions, but it's not been something that's become widespread yet. And I also think that, with some significant and honourable exceptions, some of the larger university presses have largely sat back and waited to see what's going to emerge, you know, leaning on BPCs rather than devising new models. But I think there are, you know, notable exceptions, and, you know, as you mentioned there, they are perhaps experimental, but they're also significant. So Open Publishers, we have our own library membership model, which we devised in 2015. And now you're seeing more examples of that kind of approach. So libraries being approached to fund collectively different models to support open access book publishing. So COPIM obviously has a couple that we're producing, the Open Book Collective and Opening the Future. And I think those models, they have an advantage in the sense that they're low risk as well as more equitable. So, you know, for example, for us as a publisher with a library membership model, our library membership revenue is an important stream of funding for us, and it allows us to publish our books without charging authors. But if an individual library stops supporting us, that's not going to wreck the model. Obviously, if loads of them were to leech, that would be a problem, but at the moment that's not happening. We're seeing growth there. And I think that is a kind of stability for a press. And for an individual library, we're not asking them for a huge commitment, or for an individual author, we're not saying, please give us 10 grand and we'll publish your book. You know, it's a much more kind of stable model. And so I think those kinds of experiments, that things like MIT's Direct to Open or Michigan's Fund to Mission as well, are other examples of that, which, you know, they're all done slightly differently, but I think they're all looking at that as a kind of stable way of trying to grow open access book publishing. And you can do that in a transitional way with something like Opening the Future as well, where if you have a press that has a closed access backlist, they can leverage that to get subscriptions that they can use to fund open access front list. So I think experimentation, I agree, I think it's probably quite confusing for libraries, and there's quite a lot of work that we're doing, for example, at COPIM, to try and reach out to libraries and explain, you know, and I know Charlotte's going to be able to certainly speak to that. But I also think that experimentation is potentially quite healthy.
So,
Charlie, you want to jump in?
yeah, I want to go to an analogy. I mean, we've all started a job where maybe the previous job we had, we were getting paid every 2 weeks. And then, you stop that job to start a new one, but maybe you have to wait a month or even two, whatever, to start it. And it's only paid once a month. When you think about that on a personal level and what that does to how you pay your bills, and how that you have to get the money in, beforehand, right? All of a sudden you have to shift how you are spending your money so that you are sustainable and you are able to get your groceries. This is what we're asking all of the publishers to do whenever we're asking them to flip to open access. When they were built on models where they were collecting funds after the fact to subsidize the work that was done, to do all of that up front, for especially books where it takes longer to collect that, if they're lucky enough to collect it. That's a big shift. That is really risky for them to do. Then you are also asking them to predict how much money that they could have made on a title, which they've never been good at. And we finally are able to admit they're not good at that, through a project done with De Gruyter, actually, that, as far as looking at the life of the book and predicting what's adopted or not. And then on top of that, there is no one business model that has ever supported a university press, for instance. There are many revenue models that have always been used to capture different revenue streams. And even at open book publishers, there are multiple revenue streams coming in. And what are you transitioning? What is it? It's not enough to just do it one book at a time necessarily, and that be sustainable, that be the one. You have to experiment. You start small with one book at a time, but with the idea that you continue to grow. And so that's why the experimentation is so important. That's why it's important to have multiple models, because they're trying to replace multiple models that have been sustaining them all of this time. And so we have to be sensitive to that, but it requires participation. It requires for the libraries who have the money, or the funding agencies who have the money, to be able to meet halfway so that those publishers don't feel like it's such a risk to make the shift, and it helps them know that the ecosystem is along with them, and they can continue to transition to something more like just an ongoing spend type model the pricing is tiered and looks more like subscription, on the library side. And that's one thing that I've been communicating with libraries is, yes, there are various models, and it can look confusing, especially when they all have similar names like Flip It to Open, Direct to Open, Fund to Mission, all of these things. But at the end of the day, for them, it's ongoing spend that we're asking them to commit to. Make it like a subscription line or an ongoing spend of commitment. Expect probably some kind of, small, reasonable annual increase every year, because most of the publishers right now that are experimenting also are very library friendly and sensitive to the fact that libraries don't get huge increases in funding every year, but they're designing it to make it easier. And then for those that have licenses, which some of these open programs do, like those that get access to perpetual backlist titles, it's the same thing. You're still going with a license just like you do whenever you're purchasing a collection. So it's trying to connect to what they already know and using the same kind of language, so that we have a shared experience and don't look so much at what the model is on the back end. That's for the publisher to figure out to make sure it's sustainable. But on the library side, where is their money going? Are they getting the books out of that? And what does that mean on the ground for the procurement workflows for them?
And I think that's a great lead into Steve being our publisher representative on the panel. De Gruyter's really been innovating in this area. Maybe you could comment and then give us a little insight into what's going on in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we started doing open access book publishing in 2010, so we were quite early. I think UAB didn't start until 2012. So we were receiving third-party funding for open access books. It was a mandate that was done locally at the time. That was receiving kind of government subsidies. And I think, for De Gruyter, as we think about the open access book landscape in Europe, that funding isn't as clear as it is, or there's more opportunity than there is here in the US, where a third of our funding comes from institutions, a third comes from third parties, and then a third comes from the government, either at the local, national, or local, regional, or national level. Here in the U.S., it's quite different. I think what we're seeing is really that dependency on the library to support open access, and I think even then, and I think that's working. Knowledge Online kind of started with the first real crowdfunding model that started in Europe, and that slowly has trickled over here to the U.S., where you're seeing a lot of direct open models that Charlotte referenced that are still dependent upon libraries. Whether or not that's the future, I don't know. One of the things that we're paying attention to is the MIT's direct open model and the number of libraries are participating. And I know they had their own thresholds that they wanted to achieve. Will they achieve it? I think we're paying attention, and I think right now we're looking at every semester to see if that's growing and if the libraries are going to continue to support this model. I think what's interesting is whether or not we recognize the important role that libraries do play in the sustainable, in a predictable and sustainable environment where libraries directly support open access. So I think that whether it's direct, where it's done in advance of publication, or it's indirect, it's done after publication, which is something that we're experimenting with our not-for-profit eBound model, I think remains to be seen. And I think this is a landscape where we're going to know a lot over the next probably 12 to 18 months.
Well, and I'll just add there, I know that there's been a lot, you mentioned the differences between Europe and the US in terms of funding, but on the STEM side, the new OSTP memo specifically, it expands the footprint from the former policy pretty significantly. And one of those features, it includes different content types, namely specifically books and also data. I don't know, I can't remember if Charlotte or Lucy talked about, other content that needs to travel with the book and what does that look like. But I think, over the next 24 to 36 months, that's going to alter the landscape in the United States, potentially, in terms of what is available funding, not just from libraries, but also potentially now from increased funding from the federal government. We'll see what's in the tea leaves there, but that's a pretty substantial development within the last 60 days here in the US as well. So, okay, well, this is awesome. And I so appreciate all three of your perspectives. This was kind of our dream team for this panel. So it's actually playing out. I appreciate each of your different looks and responses to these questions. So, this is always the wrap up question, what do you think, and try to make it more practical, maybe than like the 10-year crystal ball. I don't want to go there, but what's next? What's most immediate for each of you in the near term for OA Books in terms of developments and imperatives? What's next on the front burner that's really going to help to impact this landscape? Along with that, some of maybe most of the most important challenges and opportunities. But what's near term in your view? Steve, you want to kick us off? You're the only one that's not on mute, so I'll go to you.
Sure. I think that for us, I look at it through two lenses. One is through our publisher partner program, and the other one is through us as a publishing house. And I think that we've determined that 10% of our output every year is sustainable open access. We think that we're entrenched in the model specifically in Europe that kind of support that this 10% of our annual output to become open access. And I see other publishers, that's kind of around the threshold that we're seeing from other publishers of our size or even larger, about 10% of their publications are OA. So I think, is that sustainable? To me, it's all about sustainability. What is sustainable? And we think that this is a model that is sustainable and that is something that we can grow. I think for publishers, I think what I'm seeing in the landscape, especially with our partners, and we have about 30 that are all of different sizes, that I think there's actually a number, whether or not you determine, you want to be an open access book publisher or not. I think established publishing houses, it depends on their output and it depends on the size of the publisher in terms of what's realistic in terms of open access. I think that the threat is open access and sustainability, and how do we overcome those hurdles, and how do we support this greater mission of dissemination, equity and access? how do we support all of that in the current environment where sustainability, even at the paid model, is threatened. So that's something that I think is a lot more challenging, and I think that that's something that that we're getting closer to identifying. What is realistic and what can be expected from publishers as they enter this as they enter the open access landscape. And I think more on that will come over the next couple of years.
And just to quickly, do you think that's inevitable?
No, I don't. I think we want it to be inevitable. I think if you're a university press and you until that balance between cost and sustainability and is more balanced than it is now, I don't think it's inevitable. I think right now they're too far apart.
Charles or Lucy, want to jump in with a response, or maybe just your comments on, this is my to-do list for the next 12 months. Like these are the most important things.
I suppose the two things that I'm kind of looking at in the near term are, one is funder policy, as you mentioned, the new US policy and whether there's going to be any money behind that. In the UK, we've had UKRI who've put an open access books mandate in their OA policy, and we're looking to see whether the research excellence framework is going to follow suit, which is obviously important for UK academics. Will that mandate some form of open access for books or not? And there's also a project which is about to launch in Europe called Palmyra, which is going to be looking at open access funder policies and why there are not more of those and how more of them could be developed. So I think, that's important. And also it's important to think about, are those funders going to be thinking about book processing charges, or are they going to be thinking about supporting alternative models? And so I think, to go back to the previous question, we were talking about the different experiments that are currently underway in terms of how to fund open access books. Well, seeing how those develop is going to be really important. For us at COPIB and at OPP, when we talk about these models to libraries, what we're really trying to emphasize is we need participation. There are presses involved in these projects who are taking risks, who are doing what's needed to try and shift to publishing open access books without book processing charges. And if they don't meet support from the library community, those pilots are potentially going to fail. So I think trying to persuade libraries that these are things they need to be getting on board with, and then we may see those sorts of models really start to grow. And so that's kind of my focus in the near term.
Charlotte?
Yeah, and mine kind of connects to all of this, so that I think we're going to start seeing more a diverse array of publishers experimenting with open. Like Steve said, I think they might not flip completely to their entire collection being open, but they are starting to hear from their authors, as well as, from libraries and peer presses and publishers about how they could perhaps do this. And I think even smaller publishers that have always done paywalled content are going to start participating. I'm hoping to see, and this is kind of entangled, is I'm going to be working on increased library participation. It's about awareness of what programs already exist, and helping the libraries figure out how to participate in them. Now, it's not just a matter of, oh, I like this, I'm going to do this. And there are many hurdles that they have to go through. One, namely, that they've never had big book budgets necessarily. When you get down to smaller institutions, how do you get them untangled from maybe some other money that's going to, largely journals? Is there a way where we can rebalance those budgets so that they can more sustainably support books just in general, never mind if they're open or paywalled, but giving special emphasis on open because there is a bigger impact. And that's the other part. I'm thinking we're in the near future, we're going to start seeing a lot more around usage. The discoverability and the assessment or evaluation of use is going to be more important for libraries in the long term to renew, right? To continue to participate. And that means that we need to innovate how we collect usage, how we standardize book usage, and the interpretation of that. And there is a project around that of the Open Access eBook Usage Data Trust that is trying to help with this problem across all publishers. But then that means, how do we use this as an opportunity to innovate that use, to not just be, oh, it was downloaded, it was clicked, but why was it downloaded? Why was it clicked? What is the quality of use? Was it used in not just for research where you see the citations somewhere, but was it used in teaching and learning, which is something that we always talk about, but we don't know how to evaluate. And there are tools emerging that are showing not just the breadth and across the types of who's using the content around the world, but if we can attach to that how it is being used by using other proxies and measures that, still will be somewhat generalized, but I think give us a better image of why that maybe niche title was used by this very, this subdiscipline, but we see that it was almost everybody within that subdiscipline that read that book. That was a successful book, even though it had 30 users, right? We will redefine what the value of the book is. And I think these next few years are actually getting us on a path toward that. That's what I'm looking forward to, but we need the money to help sustain it so that we can continue down that path. And then the journals can catch up to the books in that way.
Well, and this is very interesting, and it was an aha moment for me, Charlotte, and when you said journal budgets have always been bigger than book budgets, period. So, going back to our first discussion topic, which is why are the journals going first? Several of you all mentioned, there's more money, more flush, but that specific component of that, just in terms of how libraries allocate their budgets, obviously, for me, that was an aha moment. Of course, we've got to sort of shift our attention now in terms of what we look at as we build out our collections and maybe revisit where these funds go, which formats in open these funds support. So that we are unfortunately out of time. This has been just tremendous. And I can't say enough how much I appreciate each of you taking the time to think about these questions and share with us today. So we are going to wrap up and turn it over to questions. And again, just thank you all so much for your time, your insight. This is a group of folks who have dedicated large portions of their professional life to innovating in this area, and we're just grateful that they shared that with us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Rose.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meg.
Okay, they'll edit this. I'm trying just to turn off the recording.